OnlyFans, the pornography application, decides to ban pornography from its site, then quickly reverses course as cultural pressure from, quote, creators. This culture is obsessed with sex, and that is not a good thing. I'm Matt Odegaard, and this is Church Public. Well, again, welcome back to Church Public. Thank you so much for joining me here today. There is a lot going on. There's still a lot going on with Afghanistan, with Haiti, with a bunch of other things in America, Australia, Canada, England, and we're going to get to some of that, but not today. Today, we are looking at the culture and the culture's obsession with sex. And the illustration we have today is this illustration from the, website and application. I'm really not that familiar, thank goodness, with this, other than it being in the news for deciding to ban some form of pornography from its site, which apparently was founded on pornography, which is nonsensical in its business model, but from a moral standpoint is fantastic. And then very quickly after decided, oh yeah, we can't do that. So we're going to look at that in a moment and what that has to do with the culture and what that has to do with us as believers. But before we get there, if you haven't checked out previous episodes, do please go to churchpublic.com and find some of those. You can also like and subscribe on all of the various podcast platforms. And if you are listening on audio, you can always check out the video at that site as well. I really appreciate your support, your sharing, your liking, your subscribing, because that helps me get the word out. And that's really what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to help normal, average, everyday believers understand more of what the Bible says, what it means to follow Jesus, and how we're supposed to live in this crazy world. And this world seems to get more and more crazy by the day. And I want to help you with that. So you don't have to believe anything I say, really. You can check it all out. I will try, even today, we're going to refer to some scriptures. And you can always go back and read them, because that is the best source of wisdom that you can have. We'll do some actual book reviews later on some other things. But again, going back to the Bible, to the Word of God, is really the best place you can go. So we're going to first look at this story from NPR, because NPR is not conservative and it is not Christian, and they obviously don't follow any biblical values at all. And so that's why this is a good source to look at and say, well, what do they say about all this? So this is first the first story. And this first story, if you are not watching, it says OnlyFans says it will ban the content it's best known for, pornography, which of course doesn't make any sense, because its literal bread and butter is, figuratively speaking, is pornography, and it was banning that from the site. So first off, this week we heard that it was banning this, and of course that ended very, very quickly. So they blamed it initially on banks. They blamed it on certain banks not being able to fund some of their, what they call, quote, creators. And there's a couple different things that are going on here in terms of language. We do come back to language a lot, because language is important, and language really helps us understand what things are and what they aren't. And unfortunately, in this particular culture, language has become so confusing that we really need to pay attention to it. And the language even tells us the values of our society. So originally, they were saying that banks were the problem, and banks were the problem because they weren't funding certain creators effectively. And it's important to make this designation. At least in the top line of this NPR article, you hear that they refer to pornography, and that's what this is, and that's what we're talking about. We're talking about this thing that is, the oldest profession that there is, the selling of your own body. And in this particular instance, it has to do with digital pictures and videos and things like that. And apparently some banks were not okay with that. And in large part, some of that was because there are illegal things going on these platforms, of course, because this is an immoral application of goods and services. And so, of course, there are immoral things going on. And it's not funny, it's terrible, but they do draw lines on certain things, as well they should, in terms of children, minors, and in terms of violent actions. Those things, of course, are bad. But as I would propose, all of it is bad. And the problem is, apparently, they just can't see that. So in an effort, apparently, to stop some of this, they went back and said they were going to ban some of the pornography from their site. Then, just a couple days later, I'll put this article up if you're watching, NPR says, reversing a planned ban, OnlyFans will allow pornography on its site after all. Which, of course, was expected, because this is, the culture does what it does. And that's why we need to stand against the culture as believers that don't believe this culture is going in the right direction. The article quotes some of the executives and says, quote, "We have secured assurances necessary to support our diverse creator community." Did you hear that? We're talking about pornography, but it slips quickly into creator. I'm just going to go off the quote for a second and say, what is a creator? Well, a person who creates this pornography, obviously, but they're not going to say that as the company, because they're going to downplay that this is something that is in any way, according to them, immoral or unlawful or those types of things. It's just creative, right? And if you're just doing creative things, what's bad about creating things? Obviously, creating is good. God created at the beginning. He created all things. So creation is good, right? And that's what they're going along. Only, of course, we know as we read between the lines and we read through, that's not really what they're talking about. So I'll continue with this quote. "We have secured assurances necessary to support our diverse creator community and have suspended the planned October 1 policy change." It goes on, "OnlyFans stands for inclusion, and we will continue to provide a home for all creators," end quote. A couple things to point out here. Inclusion, who knows what that means? That's a buzzword today. It sounds like, and this is just me reading this is their statement. It sounds like they want to include whatever they can, which of course was the problem in the first place, because there are actually unlawful things happening on this site beyond just what I would say is immoral things happening on this site. But then it goes on to say a home for all creators. Is that really what they mean to say? This is really a home for all creators? I mean, is this really a place where anyone who says or does anything is allowed? All creators? Is this really allowed? Can this really be allowed? That seems to be just impossible. And of course, immoral, because as I mentioned, just a couple of immoral things that aren't right. You could probably think of a lot more things that are just not right, and not right to be filmed, not right to do, period, flat out, full stop. And again, I think this is just a flat out lie, because of course you can't allow all things, and it can't be a home for all creators. Then this is again one of those pieces where if you begin to frame an immoral activity in language that sounds great, you're just creating, you're just an artist at this point. You're just an artist and you're using art, but the art that you're using is your body, and that begins to move into immorality. It just does. And again, initially they had blamed banks. I'm not going to name any of the banks. I don't really care. I don't think it makes that much difference. I think it's interesting that certain banks were flagging some of these transactions, I guess you would call it. One bank, I'll quote this, was described as, quote, "particularly aggressive in closing accounts of sex workers or any business that supports sex workers," end quote. So here, at least they're moving beyond the idea of creators and they're saying sex workers. But even at that, the idea here is a financial model. The ideal here is that if you are paid enough for your services, then it doesn't matter what your service is. You're just a business person. And both of these articles, in fact, and there's some other New York Times articles, a bunch of other articles that I read about it that ultimately talk about some of this being okay as long as people are paid the appropriate amount. And that's, again, just kind of like a really weird thing. Is it okay to do anything at any time, or does it make it okay if you're paid enough? There was a movie several years ago. Sorry, I didn't write it down. Indecent Proposal was the name of the movie. And the movie, similar to this, talks about being paid for sex. And initially, the person who is asked about having sex for money says, no, of course not. But then they get to, well, there is a certain amount that it would be okay at. So does that make it okay? Does the amount of money make an action okay? Or is an action, or can an action be just inherently wrong regardless of if or how much money is involved? And of course the answer is yes, an action can be wrong, but this culture, and that's what we're railing against today, says no. As long as someone is compensated appropriately, then the action is not wrong anymore. Logically even, not to mention morally, that argument of course falls apart immediately, but these are the spins, these are the things that make it difficult to deal with, because this culture bathes all of this in this flowery language, and they do it with all kinds of things. We've talked about abortion and women's health care and rights and those types of things that are all euphemisms for the same thing, killing babies. But when you say it in a nicer way, it sounds better. Same kind of thing is happening here. This is a financial model. And especially during COVID, apparently, according to these articles, this allowed, quote, again, creators and sex workers to make a good living. And again, the question comes to, is making a living the most important thing? Or might there be some underlying foundation of morality that is more important than making money? And I think, again, we all know this inherently. We know a rich person who is a terrible person is still a terrible person, even if they're rich. Even regardless of sex at this point. Think about the Christmas Carol. We know that Scrooge is a bad person. Scrooge, even as a word, is still used to describe a bad person. Why? It has nothing to do with the fact that they are rich. It has to do with the fact that Scrooge himself doesn't care for other people. And we know that caring for other people is really important. Not even just in the morality of the Bible, though that is the foundation of what we talk about, love one another. We know that in the morality even of this world, we know that to be true. We just do inherently. And we'll talk about a couple of verses that even back up the fact in a moment that we can even just live in this world without God, without knowing the Bible, and know that people have worth. But this idea now starts with pornography and goes quickly into these sex workers and then into just creators, because it soft sells what these things really are. And the New York Times wrote articles about this as well. I believe their byline was, OnlyFans reverses its decision to ban explicit content. And they say by refusing to allow payment processing programs to be allowed for pornography, of course, here's where the turn comes in this New York Times article. It says, quote, by withholding these payment processing programs, it's arguably playing into the hands of religious conservatives. So there you go. The New York Times turns this from the banks, which I don't know. Ostensibly, it was for right reasons that they stopped processing some of these payments. That information is not really shown. And for me, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter what reasons they stopped. Sometimes doing the right thing is great, even if you don't know why you're doing the right thing. And we'll look at that in just a moment as well, and some other groups that are in favor of not doing pornography, that are doing it not because of the biblical morals. But we'll look at that in a second. But in terms of this idea, do you really think that conservatives and conservative Christians have control over the major banking institutions, as this New York Times author supposes? I mean, in what world do you see that to be true? In this last year of all of the things happening, all of the woketopia, all of the corporations, and I will name a couple, Chase and Bank of America and American Express running woke training seminars, this idea that conservatives are running the financial show. I mean, that is just crazy town as far as I'm concerned. Like, in what world do Christian conservatives tell banks what to do? And the answer is none. That's not the real world. The banks are being pushed by force by the people that are running the rest of the culture. And that is the politicians, Hollywood, influencers, people with the loudest voices. And by and large, they are all coming from the left. They are all coming from the progressive worldview. So it is almost humorous to say that this whole drive to cancel OnlyFans and what they do came from conservatives. Now, again, I'm going to say, I think it should be canceled, sure. And I would sign up for that, sure. But the idea here that conservatives are ruining the profit margins of these, quote, creators is just laughable. It was the banks, and the reason the banks were doing it, we'll talk about in a moment, is because of some of these other groups that are not conservative, that are not biblical, that are pushing back against them. Groups like the feminists and groups like people who are against human trafficking, which I'm also against human trafficking. We've talked about that before on the show. The issue on the border right now is a terrible issue for human trafficking. We are set now to hit around 2 million people coming across the border, the southern border, illegally this year. 2 million. And what percentage of those will be somehow involved or harmed by human trafficking? I have no idea, and no one has any idea. And that is a terrible human tragedy. It's terrible, but that's a story for another day. Today we're talking about pornography and OnlyFans. But this goes back to the narrative. The reason that it has to get lumped in, this whole banking issue has to get lumped in with conservative Christians, is it goes back to this narrative that you've been hearing and seeing for several years about this idea that if you are against pornography, or you're against, quote, sex workers, or now in this case, quote, creatives, or against abortion, or even for marriage, or for women having babies, you're literally living in this idea of the Handmaid's Tale. And if you're not familiar, the Handmaid's Tale is this uber oppressive kind of German situation where the men tell the women everything to do, and they impregnate them. It's a whole dystopian reality, but it's not Christianity in any way. But that's what this culture is telling you. If you oppose any of these moral evils, or if you even support the idea of biblical marriage, we are now living literally in the Handmaid's Tale. And so this narrative has to keep going forward that if you're trying to shut down OnlyFans, what you want in replacement is the Handmaid's Tale. And neither thing can be true, right? Like they don't have to be in correlation together. We can be against pornography just because it's wrong, and it's horribly destructive to men and women and young people, and it's horribly addictive, and there are all these issues with it, and yet be biblical about it and not go into some weird dystopian Handmaid's Tale. I mean, obviously those things are true. But this is the narrative that's been put forth in defense of immorality, like pornography and sex work, because you should be free. This is the argument, right? You should be free to just do whatever you want to do, and it's fine as long as you're not hurting anyone. And even sometimes conservatives glom onto this and say like, well, yeah, you do whatever you want to do. You're not hurting anybody, so just keep doing whatever you want to do. I want to make 2 points to this argument because I think this is a flawed argument for a lot of things. And I'll give you 2 reasons why this is a flawed argument. The argument is, do whatever you want to do. You're not hurting anybody. The first point is, doing whatever you want to do is not right. And we inherently we know this, but for some reason we've fallen into this idea that it's true, that you just do whatever you want to do as long as you're not hurting anybody, it's fine. But that's just not true. It's not true in reality, and of course it's not true biblically. In reality, again, it's not true because there are things, if you just do whatever you want to do, eventually you will either hurt yourself or someone else. That's just how it goes. If you have no consideration for other people, obviously you're going to end up hurting someone else. That's just basic common sense. But biblically, we can look at things like Paul in 1 Corinthians 10:23. He says, all things are permissible, but not all things are beneficial. In other words, what you do does matter. And this goes throughout the whole gospel, the whole letters, the epistles, James and Peter. What you do makes a big difference. And not all things should be done. There are actions that are just inherently wrong. It doesn't matter when you do them. It doesn't matter where you do them. It doesn't even matter if someone gets hurt. Even if they don't get hurt, some actions can still be wrong. And we know this to be true. We know certain things are wrong, but somehow we get confused by this idea of freedom. We get confused by this idea that apparently all things are supposed to be free. We are free. We are free from the law. We are free from the power of sin and death, but we're also called to not live in sin. This is the biblical mandate. And again, I could pull up 20 verses right now. I'm not going to just for time, but I'll just give you this one. Paul, Romans 6. Shall we sin because we are no longer under the law? And he responds, this is a rhetorical question that Paul asks. Shall we sin because we are no longer under the law? Emphatically, he answers with exclamation points in almost every translation. I looked, no. And in Greek, it's also a really strong word that he puts in there. No. In other words, like, we're free really to do whatever we want. But should we do whatever we want? Like, is everything beneficial? Paul says in the one verse that we looked at, no. And in the other verse, no. we're in this crazy culture, this crazy world where I guess maybe it feels judgmental. Maybe it's just reality. I don't know why, but we're so averse to saying, hey, that's sin, don't do it. Hey, that's bad, don't do it. Even if you're at home by yourself and no one else is around, if it's still bad, don't do it. And yet there's this idea that if you're at home by yourself, if no one knows, if no one sees, then it's fine if you do it and it doesn't hurt anybody and it's fine. No. That's called licentiousness. That's called, like, it's sin is sin, regardless of who's around, what happens. Again, we go on and on about that. I feel like I'm starting to preach, but this is important because calling sin is reality. But the culture more and more claims to rewrite reality and call it real. But just because you call an apple an orange, it doesn't make it an orange. And the same could be said for male and female. Those are the things that we're talking about. And in this case, we're talking about pornography. We're talking about, is pornography really just being a creative artist, or is pornography just pornography? And again, I could go through so many verses that say pornography, which is from a Greek word, porneo, in both a verb and a noun. It's in there a lot because it has existed for a long time, for longer than we have, and it has been wrong and bad and hurtful, not just to the person who's doing it, but also to the person who is consuming it. It has been wrong for a long, long, long time. And it continues to be wrong, regardless of how much money you get for it, regardless of if you, quote, hurt anybody, end quote, or not. It's just bad. Here's another New York Times article. How OnlyFans became the latest casualty of the war on porn. OnlyFans is now a casualty of the war on porn. Again, this is going back to conservatives and Christians are apparently waging a war on porn, which apparently has casualties. I mean, it's so laughable, but it stirs emotions, right? And that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to stir your emotions. Oh no, this is another casualty. First of all, a thing can't be a casualty because it's a thing, but that's just grammar. Secondly, this is a moral argument. They are putting forth a moral argument to say that pornography is a moral good because there are, quote, sex workers, end quote, that get paid to do it, and it is lucrative. In these articles, I won't read you these quotes, but there are several, what do they call them? I guess creators, going with their language, who say how much money they make from doing this and how much money they stand or stood to lose when for a quick second it was not legal on the site. Here's the bottom line. Sex work and pornography have always been lucrative. I was just reading James the other day. I think this is really interesting. I was just reading James the other day, and I was reminded in the Bible note on James, like, you know, some of you have study Bibles that have like extra things on the side. I don't know if you have those things, but some of them have extra study notes on the side. I'll show you right here, like, you know, extra study notes on the side. I don't know if you can see that. Okay, didn't really plan for that, but I was reading James and just reading through the study notes on the side. And so I'm reading in James 6. Here's the verse. So truly be glad. There is a wonderful joy ahead, even though you must endure many trials for a little while. Now that is just quite a verse to meditate on and figure out what this culture is doing to Christians. And that is kind of what we're talking about, but also a longer lesson for another day. But the study note reminded me of some of my graduate education, which was in Greek and Roman history, studying actual, you know, reading Greek and looking at Greek and Roman things like temples and stuff like that. And so this was interesting. The study note reminded me of this. Number one, Christians were persecuted because they stood against the emperor for not worshiping him. So if you didn't know, the emperor of Rome required, he did believe he was a deity. Just like, you know, Daniel and that whole thing and Rakshak and Benny, if you're familiar with those stories. The emperor believed they were a deity, and so you were only allowed to worship the emperor. And that's not entirely true. You were allowed to worship other things, but if you didn't worship the emperor, then you could get in a lot of trouble because it was actually considered treason, and then you're doing a crime against the state or the government, which of course is punishable by death, which is why they killed a lot of Christians. That's number one. But the bigger point is number two, and this was a point that I had forgotten about because there's just so many things going on. Christians refused to worship at pagan temples after they were converted, because obviously, if you're following Jesus, you're not going to worship at a pagan temple. But in the temples were very lucrative, both for buying things that you would sacrifice and buying idols, but also sex work. Sex work was a big part of temples, and they were present in many of the Greek and Roman temples. And that's you may not have known this about Greek and Roman history, but in the temples, that's where a lot of the sex work took place. And so these temples started losing money, and that's what we're talking about today, right? We're talking about the loss of money, because the banking industry is what really started this whole thing. That by losing the finances that you get out of sex work, all of a sudden Christians in the 1st century, 2nd, 3rd century, and on, and now this century, are being persecuted, because when you follow the morality of God, you are against the things that are immoral in the culture. And that's the real issue. It's not a new development in banking and finances, I guess, are now proposed as some kind of morality, but they fall apart, just as we saw, whenever pushes back in the slightest, because they can't hold a morality that's based on anything solid. But morality based on the values of God, they're obviously more durable. When we base our understanding of value on the inherent worth of every human because of God's image upon them, all of these other issues dissolve. For instance, in pornography, using a person just for sex in any form, whether actual or digital, is degrading to that person. It's objectifying to that person. And ultimately, it's also degrading to yourself, because we were designed for sex inside of a committed relationship under the headship of God, and our bodies are a temple of God. So doing things that are degrading to what God has designed obviously are, by nature, by definition, immoral. But it's this very objectification that Christians have an unlikely ally, the feminists, and those that oppose sex trafficking, because at least for this issue, the feminists know objectifying women is morally wrong, and they are correct in this issue. Of course, objectifying anybody is morally wrong, and this is a moral war. But those that don't follow Jesus, even they understand that morality is not subjective, but they get a little bit lost when they stop following the word of God, and they fold a little bit, because all of a sudden, where does that line get drawn? And you see earlier, as we talked about, maybe if you get paid enough, then it's okay, because then you're not objectified anymore. But does that really make it okay? Of course that doesn't make it okay. And that's what we come down to here. We come down to the word of God, the truth, and you can try to obscure the truth, but even morality will always surface. That's what's kind of interesting to me in this whole deal. You have feminists who are against this. You have people who are against sex trafficking who are against this. And of course, they're right. They should be against this. We should be against this. But even they who don't have the word of God and who don't understand have some understanding of morality. And I'll point to Paul in Romans 1:20, who says, "For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power, his divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse." In other words, even if you don't know God, even if you don't read the Bible, you can still know what things are right and what things are wrong. But then, of course, they start spinning themselves in knots, because, well, maybe this person says it's right and maybe this person says it's right, and they lose their foundation really quickly. And this is where these arguments, even of feminists and those that oppose this for other reasons, they fall apart, because they only have part of the story. And this is why the banks folded, and it's this morality based on offense, right? I'm offended by how you acted, so what you're doing is immoral. But and while that's true, that's not the foundation. The foundation has to be, you have inherent worth because of who you were made in Jesus and in the image of God, and you are a temple of God as a believer. And even if you're not a believer, you still have value as a child of God, and that's why you have value. What you do makes a difference. So yes, objectification is wrong, exploitation is wrong, and it's not only in certain circumstances, it's in all certain circumstances, and that's why this goes further. And I just want to give you a couple more. I know I've gone a little bit long today, but I want to give you a couple more things, and because this is where the end of this goes, and the end of this goes in a really dark place. And this is connected to the OnlyFans question, but it really is a different issue, and really a more malevolent issue. That means like really a bad issue, because these creative lewd pictures and videos are wrong, not just because they objectify, but because they go against the kingdom order of God, and you are the temple of God, and so you shouldn't consume that which makes you unclean. But the inappropriateness is, I would say, just inappropriate, period. Then, unfortunately, because these people who say some things are inappropriate, but some things are less inappropriate in pornography, you end up with these really weird statements, and I'll put it on the screen and I'll read it for you if you don't have it on the screen. But you run into these things like the BBC saying, what's the best way to inform teenagers about porn? Should there be age-appropriate porn? ? So this is the crazy place that we get to when we draw lines on certain things, but the lines aren't based in morality. All of a sudden we say, well, all porn isn't good, but some porn is good, so we should find porn that's okay for teenagers. Again, it feels like I'm taking crazy pills and saying crazy things, but this exists. And people are asking these questions because the morality is not based in God. It's not based even in reality, and it's not based in the health of any particular person. It's just based in some idea that they have that changes with shifting sand, apparently. So you have the BBC saying we should have age-appropriate porn. You have other people on Twitter saying someone needs to create porn for children who have careers because of their famous parents. They need, quote, entry-level porn. We're in such a crazy madhouse where we need entry-level porn, age-appropriate porn. What would that be? And how would you regulate that? It doesn't make any moral sense. If something is wrong, it is just wrong, period. And these people are trying to compromise. I'm going to give you just one more because, again, this is not isolated. This is not just one random crazy person saying we should do this. It is several people, and with a lot of likes on the social media, saying, oh yeah, we should definitely do this, make age appropriate porn and these kinds of porn. And this last person that I'll read, similar message. Some people need to create porn for children. Hear me out. Young teens are already watching porn, but they're finding hardcore. I'm going to skip a bunch of words here. They need entry level porn. I'm just going to leave it at that because to me this is just super gross. And it's this thing that I keep coming down to in a lot of the studies that I'm doing and a lot of the things that I'm looking at. Everything is sexual. That's what I said at the beginning. And they want your kids to experience this too. And they can't figure out how to mainstream it, so they try to soft sell it by saying it's just creative to do pornography. And we need entry-level pornography for children. No, I'm just going to say no. The answer we need to start saying and standing up and saying as loudly or as we can is just no. None of this is good. It is all bad. It doesn't matter how you package it. It doesn't matter what you call it. It doesn't matter if you make money for it. It's just bad, period. There can be bad things in this world because there are good things in this world. One necessitates the other. There can't be anything good if everything is good. Then it's all just vanilla. No, things are bad, and we have to start saying the bad things, and we have to start standing against this. And I think these two examples, these several examples, are important for us to understand because the children are the ones that are affected by this the most. Porn is not good for anyone at any time, at any age. Canceling this is the right thing to do, no matter what the culture says. And here we have another situation to take a direct stand against the culture. We need to call true things true. We need to stand up for what is right. We need to stand against what is wrong, regardless of what the culture says. I'm going to read it just a couple more verses for you, and I'm going to let you go. Galatians 6, let us not grow weary of doing good, for in due season we will reap if we do not give up. Don't give up. And Paul again in Philippians, you should prove yourself to be blameless and innocent children of God, above reproach, in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you appear as lights of the world. These are the important things that we need to keep track of. This is the way of Jesus. to not just accept that this culture is going to do whatever they do, to not say, yeah, do whatever you want as long as it isn't hurting anybody. No, we need to say there are right things and there are wrong things. And you can and probably will hate me for saying that. And as humbly as I can say, I don't care. I'm going to stand with Jesus on this. I'm going to stand with the disciples and the apostles on this. I'm going to follow their lead because, one, Jesus, if there's a man who dies and comes back to life again, I'm going to listen to everything he has to say. So I don't care what the culture says. If the guy who came back to life says something, I'm listening to him. And two, the people who were literally with him and walked with him on this earth said other things that were the same things, I'm going to listen to them. That's what we need to do as Christians, following the way of Jesus. We need to continue to follow the way of Jesus, even though, and especially now, it is more and more against culture. They are not going to like you. They are not going to agree with you. They may even, as we've read about in these verses, persecute you. But God is with you, and he will never leave you. He will never forsake you. He will give you the Spirit inside to give you what you need to go through these days that I think are going to get harder maybe before they get better. I hope that God blesses you in the midst of all this and gives you peace. And of course, as always, I hope that you continue to keep the faith.